Hey everybody, and welcome to Sticky Icky Live Classics. And tonight we have got a pretty cool car to talk about, and I added a bonus car tonight. So let's just get down to it. Let's see. Can everybody hear me? Okay. When is the Falcon going to make an appearance? You know what? I can make that happen for you. So we're going to talk all night long about hyperdrives, specifically about the 1996 classic, the Hyperdrive STX. Now, let me give you a little bit of a history about hyperdrive. It was started by a company called PTI, which was a battery and military supplier, and they made a whole bunch of other things in Pilot Mountain, North Carolina, and they got into the hyperdrive business. I don't know all the pieces there, but that began early 90s. They had a couple of cars that came out. Primarily, though, they were known for a belt drive technology in their early wide cars, and we're going to show you a couple of those pieces tonight. The car that we're talking about, though, was STX, which took a huge leap forward. It was first in a whole bunch of places, but it was not the first pivot ball car. In fact, if we look, the first pivot ball car actually was the RS, which preceded it in a short run. But and then there were a couple of variants for on-road. But basically what the pivot ball did is it had, in this car, there's 4 spots, and it allowed for the rear end to go separate from the T-plate. So the T-plate just became a mounting bracket for 4 pivot balls. Now, we'll get into those a little bit later, too. The second thing that it did is it allowed the side-to-side action to occur without the stress of going back and forth. So they're basically able to isolate the movement. Now, this car has this bar across the front, and what you could do, your servo would mount on here, and then you could actually set the amount of caster that you wanted by loosening these 2 screws up, and it used a split block, and then you could slide this back. So you had an infinite amount of adjustment for your front caster. Now, it had no camber adjustment, but a lot of the Bowlink guys at the time they would take these pins and they would bend them, and you would just build in a static camber gain. Now, the other thing to notice is that it actually ran the springs on top. And so when you had your movement here, you would go up and down, crushing the spring, versus the modern version, which would pull the spring into compression. Now, the second thing, and this was actually pretty cool, is you could crank down this nut and preload the spring. So you could change spring rate, you could bend this, and then you could change for camber, you could get the caster. And then also you had where you could turn the nut, and I'll just show you kind of how it works. You just turn the nut and you get a little bit more compression or a little less. Now, the plate on here was, like I said, you mounted the servo here. So the servo kept the same angle as the arms. This is a little bit of a car. I don't remember we got this one. We've had it for a while. We haven't restored it yet, but I wanted to give you a good idea. This was the predecessor to the STX. Now, couple of other things. STX was going to go and they would lose these brackets and you would just pick up these, but there was a few other things that they did that were special. So let's get into our friend, the STX, which was my personal favorite pan car in the 1990s. So we've got a, this is actually an original protoform body from the time. It's a 1996 Thunderbird. Some of you guys commented there was a Lincoln that was made. Bowlink made a Lincoln for a little bit, and it's extraordinarily rare. I know there's a couple floating around, but impossible to find. Actually, there's two impossible to find Bowlink bodies. One is the Beretta, and the other one is the Lincoln. But this actually, like I said, this is a protoform body, and this would have been, they started smoothing everything out on the bodies, and then the following year, Protoform actually released a 97, but they also released a Velodrome body right in that time period too. So some pretty cool history on this car. Now, it is sporting the Slicks graphics. This is the John Andretti 37 car, Little Caesars Kmart car. And you would notice there were two versions of this one too. There was the later version, which had the white Super K, actually was when Super K came out. They were advertising that. And then there was one that would have had the Little Caesar guy standing next to it. Slicks made both versions, but I haven't been able to locate that. So this car's got a few things that are completely out of period and unoriginal. But we ran this, I actually just left it the way we ran it last. So it was ran as a breakout car. And it's got kind of a cool thing now, I guess. It's kind of getting retro. It does have a Putman D35, which became an illegal motor for the 13.5 class. And then it's got an original Hobby Wing just stock. So they actually came in this blue. This is an original one in that generation. Then it's got, for some reason, we had a Spectrum in it. I think it was because we needed the width, because the way the chassis had been drilled by the previous owner. So couple of things that are really important to note. One is the STX versus its predecessor did get a brand new T-plate. And so what you'll find is this T-plate actually comes to the center of the chassis. So the front pivot ball was on the center. The other T-plate much shorter. Also, you're going to see that this is a center T-plate, and they went to an offset T-plate. Now, a couple of other things that take it apart is they picked up this triangle. This is an aluminum piece. Let me pull it around here so you don't have the speed control in your way. That aluminum piece actually further isolates this shock. So when you look at the original design, the shock was held in place, and so you would still get an angle movement on this. By the time the STX came around, they had adapted that. So now when you watch, the rear end of the car will actually pivot, and the entire shock doesn't change the angle. This is also a pretty cool set of shocks. These are original Deltas on here. And like I said, I'm surprised this one, I mean, for 25 years old, actually still holds oil really, really well. And then these are newer RPM, but that would have been probably some Dubro stuff at the time would have been more appropriate, but they got upgraded to that. Now, what I wanted to do before we get much farther into the car is I wanted to show you exactly how the pivot balls work. And so let me go to our toolbox here. And what we've got are a few of these pivot balls. Now, what they actually were, let me bring you, I'll come up to you, is you had this black, let me focus in on it for you. That did not focus. That's worse. Let's see. We'll do it this way. There you go. Now, the way that these worked is you had this aluminum piece that went in. It's kind of a bell design. And then that would go into this plastic, this plastic hub. And then you would have a set of really small screws. These two here. They came in aluminum. They had some brass ones. And so you pop this in and you would get to this assembly. Then on the T-plate, you would take and you would align the screws, flip it over, and then the screws went in, and then you had your main screw that held everything together that also went in there. Now, there were a couple of problems. Actually, that's how the screws came originally, by the way. That's one of the packages there that's got the screw sets. Now, the couple of problems would arise. One is with this car, and this was actually one of the fatal flaws of it, is you would get excessive wear in the pivot balls, and it could allow the rear end to shuck back and forth. Same thing, you would get wear in these pivot balls, basically from dirt and everything getting between the aluminum, and you could get a really sloppy rear end. So one of the ways that you can tell, if you find one of these kind of out in the wild and you're collecting, is just take the rear end, move it around, and if it's pretty solid, this one's, like I said, extraordinarily new. You've got a pretty good rear end. The other thing that's interesting about this is how it mounted on. So what you had is the pivot balls went directly to the aluminum rear pod plates. And so you had screws that came up through the bottom, and they actually went into the pod plate. So the two pod plates connect directly to the pivot balls. The pivot balls connect to the T-plate, and then you had this triangular piece in here that was what also went to the T-plate, and that gave you all your independent action on it. So really, like I said, really elaborate way of solving through it. Now, remember, if you watched the video last week, the guys that kind of took this design another step further was the Woods car, and it ran a pivot ball, but they actually refined the pivot balls, got a ton of weight out of it. Now, what's interesting, though, is that our friends at Hyperdrive would soon release what was called the SSE. And then later on, there was an 0500 chassis that became extraordinarily popular. They went back. They kind of dumped all of the complexity of the pivot balls, went back to a T-plate design similar to the 10L, and then put a swizzle stick on it. And those, for the next 5-6 years, became one of the most state-of-the-art, most driven cars. Pretty much everybody had a swizzle stick design car, and then you would kind of see that go back to a 3-shot car later. But Hyperdrive, after they left this car, never went back to a pivot ball design. Now, let me move some of these things back out of the way. And let me check. Says, try not to kill the internet tonight. Protoform Dodge is also hard to find. It is Mr. Charlie, but I have a couple of those. So actually, the Intrepid. Then they also made Charlie Cochran there ran Bolink LeBarons. He actually ran a LeBaron, that's also a hard body to find. So, all right, let's go back to the front end of the car. Now, what you're going to see, this is the original kind of, I guess, Gen 2 10L front end. It's this typical, basically, multiple part arms. So you had these would have been your active strut camber, I think is what they called it, or caster blocks. And so you had an angled one and you had the flat one. Pretty much everybody ran the flat ones at this period. Now, later on, and within the next couple of years, you would see aluminum replacements for these blocks coming into play that would offer multiple hole locations. But these are the original associated pieces, and they're also not molded plastic. This is actually a set of molded carbon or graphite pieces that they made, and so that was it's a pretty cool find that this car had them. And then this pin is also not a stock pin, and I actually don't know who made that pin. If somebody on here that does kind of speak up, but I do not know who manufactured those pins, but they're actually a pretty sweet piece. And then you've got a couple of set screws that hold that in. If you're not familiar with the 10L front end, and we're going to see a lot of these over the next couple of weeks as we go through cars, the 10L front end had a couple of design features. One, you had where you could move your caster by changing these little tabs. You could pull them out, move them forward, move them back, and it gave you a few degrees of caster change. Again, the camber was changed by this, and you could go in and out. Some folks would start grinding on it, and then, you know, a lot of elaborate pieces went into that. This and the basis of this front end are still, I mean, super common in all of pan cars today. The design has just lived on. A couple of other things. This design also introduced putting the tie rods at an angle. And what that did is it took out bump steer. And then it's got this really cool part on here. So most of these, what you would see in this era, would just have a piece of rod that would have a couple of screws in it. This has actually got an adjustable black machined piece. It's just, I think it's an absolute gorgeous piece for this car on there. And then these were stock hyperdrive parts. And these are actually, you can order those today. That is still an orderable part from hyperdrive. Now, as we go to the rear end, a few things to note. One, this may look like kind of the normal rear graphite rear end axle that you're used to seeing, but it's actually not. And so you may, this is what's in this, and this was pretty common for the era, is it's got a graphite axle here and then an aluminum end out here. And so they glued these together. Basically, it's just like a fishing rod. They trued these down, slid this on. This was an absolute nightmare to break. You would break these things pretty frequently. Remember a few things. One, cars way heavier back in the day. So when you really hit some things. Yeah, and so it's IRS. That would have made sense at about that time. And you'd bust them, and there's a whole bunch of just issues on that. But it was this is a really cool kind of survivor from that. I think most of them are in two pieces somewhere in the landfills. The other thing is a lot was going on in the diffs. This has got a pinned diff, and so it was pretty common to have a pin diff at the time, but there was also a couple of different designs going on. One, you could get ceramic, oops, sorry about that. You could get ceramic diff rings, and then that was a pin diff. You could also get an O-ring rear diff. And then if you remember last week, we had the fiberglass rear end. So there was a lot of technology kind of floating around on the rear of the cars at that time. Now, you're going to see two of these Allen screws, set screws sitting here. What that was, and I didn't have them on that car because we were running on carpet. That was for your rear diff wing, or your rear diff wing, for your rear wing that would have went up out of the body, and they just threaded on. So, like I said, a whole bunch of things. Now, the other piece of this is this side. You'll notice is the same as this side, and you're like, why would you have had motor screws on the left side of the car? Well, that was an option that was also available on the STS. You could take two of these. So instead of running the traditional, what we know now is a traditional, this was cutting edge at the time, gear diff, they offered a pretty cool line of basically pulleys. And so what you would have is you would have basically different size pulleys that went to different lengths of belts that would go to, let me find it, instead of the spur gear, that would go to these. And so you replace out your rear spur gear with a rear pulley. It's got the holes in it. Sorry, it's got the holes in it for the diff, just like you would have before. Then you had multiple different lengths of belts, like multiple different lengths of belts. And they were sized by tooth. So you would have a 69 tooth. This happens to be a 72 tooth. Happens to be a 65 tooth. And so you kind of, by the time you got done with this thing, you had just a little bit about everything that you could get. And then that would run. Now, the only problem with the belt drive, remember, is the motor has to run backwards. So the way they solved that is you would spin the motor around and run it off of this side, which would give you basically the backwards rotation that you needed to get the car to go. So just like I said, that is late 1989, 90 technology. And like I said, this car was built a few years later, so that started to disappear, but you could still retrofit this to run it. Now, you're like, why would they do that? Well, there was a couple of things. At the time, there was a thought that it was going to be far more efficient. They also advertised it as being quieter. I don't know, maybe in the era of 32 tooth, 48 pitch, 38, 32 pitch gears, that they might have had a noise issue, but I think that wasn't really it. I think it was just a really cool marketing play, and it had some efficiency. What it couldn't do, though, as the motors got stronger and stronger, you'd suck a rock into it, ruin them. You'd break a belt. You just added a whole lot of complexity, but moreover, added a whole bunch of weight. So that's why folks began to move away from it. And if you hadn't seen, by the way, I just kind of passed by this, but this is the original PTI packaging, and it's got the PTI label on there. And that was the original Hyperdrive logo. And then it's gone through a few different hands and a few different things, and it's become the Hyperdrive they are today. Now, one last thing that I wanted to show you that Hyperdrive at this time was also known for. And you're like, what would be kind of the goofiest thing possible? Delrin rear hubs. Now, let me give you a quick look at this. So here's why one, super light. They were super light, but they used this big set screw that would always strip out, and you would strip these out. And so when they were brand new, it was a great idea. Quickly, aluminum kind of took over. Let me see if I can, there you go. And then there is the hub. So Delrin rear parts, like I said, super light, actually a pretty cool thing. But you just could not crank this set screw down. It would slip the rear end. And like I said, they made everything in like 800 different lengths. So that, my friends, I'm going to come back to the car here, put it up so you can see it, and then we'll take a few questions on the Hyperdrive. Let me refocus it for you. The Hyperdrive. Oops, my hand was in the way. There you go. Hyperdrive STX. So let's go ahead and see what we've missed anything. So we have Rob Goodman. Yeah, he has a Hot Bodies Avenger that he won't do anything for. Charlie says, I have 4. You have 4. The first one I have them for 96. Are you saying you have LeBarons left? Let me know. Tunnel bottom spacers were sanded down to the angles that fit the front tire and the laydown. Yes. Let's see. My first pan car. Hey, you had a 10 RS. Awesome. Yeah, Blake, they were 42 ounces, 6L. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, I don't know how many belt drive pieces I left. We came across those a number of years ago. That's about the 3rd time I think I've ever had them out. The Cursed Horse Trophy. Yeah, I've seen it. Let's see. The pulley system killed motors with heat. Didn't last long. Yep, they were quiet. And then let's see. Yeah, different links. That, and in fact, Charlie brings up a great point. So one of the things that was super popular was adjusting the rear end width, but pulling this tire in and out was a lot for the, because remember, we didn't have in the early 90s, you barely had carpet, and so you didn't have the CRC carpet. So they got black, they had gray before that. We're talking you would go to a track and they would have like living room carpet, or you would go to a gymnasium floor, or you're going to run, and if you were in Michigan, you would run the car on carpet, potentially concrete with some sanded paint. You'd run a gym floor, you'd run it on caps. You ran just about everything asphalt in Grand Rapids. And so there had to be a lot of adjustability. That's where you got all the variability in this. It wasn't just it wasn't, hey, we got the Snowbirds track and everything's basically that. It was a variety of tracks that these cars had to run at. And that's why you've got so many variants of that. So let's see. Oh, you have hot bodies. Oh, there you go. And then we'll be chatting later on that. Yeah, Rob has a lot of the cool guy stuff. Yeah, I know where he gets it from. Let's see. We're going to do that car, actually. We have, and it won't be for a couple of 3 weeks. We're going to do the bowling next week, Mark. But we are going to go back and talk about the RC10L, the RC10L SS, and then the all of kind of the variants of that. We're going to do probably 2 or 3 shows going through all of the 10L variants. But we're going to go to some wide cars because I don't think a lot of people have seen those. But hold on, because we have an original 10L SS. And if you haven't seen one of those, they actually ran batteries on both sides. So they had where you could run a 6-pack on one side, or you could run a 4-2 configuration on those original cars. The reason I say you may have never seen one, because at that time you went into the boom, NASCAR is happening, and you would have everything from I think you had guys that were making, I'm trying to come up with a couple of them. There was a carbon company I just can't pull out of my head that actually just started making tons of conversion cars, and so that's what we'll get into, and we'll talk a little bit about that. BME fiber, that was what was in the that was the yellow ones. That was what was in there. So all right, any other questions, comments? I think we're pushing in on our half an hour time frame that we like to keep it in, so I'll leave it for one more round of questions. Anybody else? Anybody like this one? This is, like I said, this is one of my personal favorites, and we're getting it out of the we have we call it the library, but we have a pretty big storage area that we keep all of the cars in. And Reese was making fun of me because I actually I think we ran this once, and then somebody else came out to practice, and I pulled it off and never ran it again because I figured I would never find another one for all of this. And Charlie, if you join me next week, I promise I will show Composite Craft. Thank you, Tim Green. Charlie, if you join next week, I have got some classic 1990s photos of your hot bodies. A little less talk, a lot more action. I have that photo of you holding it, so I'll show that. Let's see. HPI did make one. Actually, that was the beginning of some of the HPI stuff back then. Let's see. We had a blast. Ran a bunch of those handout motors. Ask Corns about his carpet car. That was, yes. That's another one, by the way. I'm going to do, Goodman's on me about this, but I think we're going to do a series of trying to get some of these guys that ran back in the 90s, like Mike and Coins and everybody, to talk about some of those cars. There's some of these incredible stories, and there was some great times. And so we'll probably bring on not only classic cars, but classic people to talk about it. So let's see what else we got. Charlie says he'll be here. Well, I'll get those photos. I know where all of the Major Taylor photos are. So, one, I appreciate everybody joining us. We weren't sure the type of response we'd have for an old guy sitting around talking about old pan cars, but we're going to do a few other cars too, by the way, as we go along with this, because it's been a lot of fun. Appreciate everybody that's viewing in, and just take care. We're going to get back to racing soon, and until then, if you find a classic car, try to restore it. It's a piece of engineering and a piece of cool times from the past. So appreciate everybody. Take care. If you have a chance, join us on Thursday night for the Sticky Live, where we do a lot of kind of tips and that for the dirt late model crowd. And we're going to go back to some basics there. Last week we were building some shocks. We're going to do a couple other things this week. So like I said, if you got time, have the interest, join us Thursday night on Sticky Live. Otherwise, we will see you next Tuesday. Take care.